Good morning to everyone. I'm Usec Karl Chua. I would like to share with you today our reform in the comprehensive tax program. I would like to first be upfront and say that this tax reform is really about investing in our future. It is not about plugging a deficit or paying our debts. That was the case years or decades ago when we as a country were going in and out of fiscal crisis or balance of payment crisis. From 1945 up to 2005, we have been in a stabilization mode. Every 3 or 5 years, we would have to face a crisis. Our macroeconomic condition was rather unstable. But for the first time in our history, we can begin to think very long term. That is why this tax reform is really about investing in our future. It is about taking off the ship that has been rather unstable for many decades in the past. In truth, we would like to see our tax reform address poverty once and for all. We would like to see poverty rate, which is 21.6% as of 2015, fall to 14% by the end of the Duterte administration in 2022. That is uplifting 6 million Filipinos out of poverty. The poverty line today is 60 pesos per person per day, and we would like to eradicate totally poverty in one generation or by 2040. This is our ambition natin 2040. We would also like to see this country graduate from the low middle income country status today to an upper middle income status by 2022 and onwards to becoming a high income country where no one is poor in one generation. That is a generation of my child and your children and grandchildren, our future. Without the tax reform, the poor will likely remain poor because there will be little or less significant investment in infrastructure, education, and health. Many people are saying that we do not need the tax reform because the economy is doing very well. And I would say they are true if they only want the business as usual. But we do not want business as usual. We want a radical change in the way we live and to impart to our children and grandchildren a far better future than the one we experience. Without the tax reform, we will have much less budget for rural infrastructure, such as badly needed farm-to-market roads and irrigation. Farmers would be hard-pressed to sell their produce in the market and move out of poverty. Without the tax reform, urban congestion will remain a major challenge. There will be little improvement in public transportation. There will be more time in traffic. Personally, I spend up to 4 hours on the road every day. That is like being taxed 33% of my 12-hour productive day. And there will be much less time for loved ones. Instead of having dinner with loved ones, you are stuck on the road. Without the tax reform, poor quality education will pervade. The previous administration passed a very important reform, the K-12 program. Our challenge today is to fully fund that by providing more than 100,000 new classrooms and hiring almost 200,000 new teachers. Without the tax reform, classrooms will continue to be cramped, teachers overworked, hampering learning potential among our children. Without the tax reform, quality healthcare will continue to escape the poor. Many of the poor, when they get sick, sell their assets so that they can afford medical care, their motorcycle, their tricycle, or their carabaos, not knowing that when they get well, they have no more asset to use to improve their livelihood. And the poor are likely to get sick and not be attended well if we do not provide more than 15,000 barangay health centers and over 200,000 new health workers to the countryside. Life is basically about having healthy mothers so that they can have healthier children. Once children are healthier, they can finish school. Once they finish school, they can get more and better jobs above minimum wage. And this is precisely the story and the reason why we do the tax reform. But even if people are educated and healthy, they need to have support from the government to bring them to school, to work, or to their homes so that they can be productive as well. Many people say that we do not need to do tax policy reform because we can just improve the BIR and the BOC. This is very true, and in fact, this has been our objective since day one last year, and will continue to do so in the next 5 years. However, we still need tax policy reform because the problem also is found in the design of our tax law. For instance, we do not index many taxes to inflation. such that after 20 years, we have been losing billions because of this non-indexation, while prices, income, and our GDP continue to grow. Second is we have, because of well-meaning intention, provided a lot of special treatments and exemptions to lobby groups, to interest groups, to sectors we want to protect, and to vulnerable groups. Many of these, while well-meaning, create a lot of leakage, as I will explain later. And finally, we have no way to audit taxpayers because of our absolute bank secrecy. Together with Lebanon, we are two countries in the world that cannot open bank accounts. That is why we need to reform tax policy if we are to help the BIR and the BOC improve their tax administration. As a result, we have one of the highest tax rates in the region. In fact, our income and VAT are among the highest, but we have a very narrow base. Half of the economy do not pay some form of taxes. That is why we have a tax system that is inequitable, complex, and inefficient. That is the reason why, apart from tax administration reform, we have to do and go to Congress to propose tax policy reforms. Fortunately, we have a comprehensive tax reform program which is being led by Secretary Dominguez and backed by the President. In the first package, or the tax reform for acceleration and inclusion, we are proposing to enact important reforms to simplify, to make more fair and more efficient our tax system. There are four major components of this tax reform: the lowering of the personal income tax, the expansion of the VAT, the increase in the oil excise, and the increase in the automobile excise. Let me begin with the good news. We are a country that has not adjusted our income tax brackets for 20 years. And we are a country committed to ASEAN integration where tax rates are falling below 25%. That is why we will return to the people what they deserve, all their hard work in the last 20 years, in the form of lower income taxes. Our proposal is as follows. The first 250,000 taxable income will already be exempt from income taxes. That will benefit 83% of Filipinos immediately. It already incorporates the 50,000 personal exemption and the 25,000 additional exemption for each dependent not exceeding 4. On top of that, we have the 82,000 13th month bonus as an additional exemption. The rest of the taxpayers, so long as they are not having incomes above 5 million, will see much lower income tax rates. For instance, a supervisor in a private firm or a public hospital doctor with an annual salary of 500,000 currently faces a 32% marginal tax rate. Under our tax reform in January 2018, that will fall to 25%. And after 3 years, it will fall further to 20%, thereby bringing a lot of disposable income to the people. Only the richest 1%, those with income above 5 million, will have to pay a slightly higher marginal income tax of 35%. But that is because we want to evolve a very progressive tax system, which our constitution requires. We were returning to the people 140 billion initially because of their hard work, but we also expect our economy continue to grow because of this important reform. Together with the income tax reform is a reduction of the estate and donors taxes to 6% to align to the capital gains. For instance, a call center agent, just to give an example, with a 21,000 monthly salary, a 13th month pay, and a few bonuses, currently pays 21,867 per year in income taxes. Under our reform, that call center agent will pay 0, bringing home 21,867 more per year. If they are 2 in the family, that is more than 40,000 that they can use to buy groceries, to travel, but hopefully to save and invest in their children's health and education. If we stop here, it will be good for the people initially, but it will be bad for the country in the long term because we will lack the resources to deliver the 9 other promises that President Duterte made in his 10-point socio-economic agenda. That is why we also need to reform the VAT, the oil, and the automobile excises. On the VAT, we have a very complex system. We have one of the highest VAT rates in the ASEAN, or rather the Asian region, next to China, 17%. However, in our tax law, we have 59 lines of exemptions. And outside the tax law, we have 84 additional special laws, proposing or giving various types of exemption on the VAT. Compare that with our neighbors with a much lower VAT rate between 6 and 10%, but also with far less lines of exemptions, typically limited to agriculture, raw food, education, and health. That is why when we compare ourselves with Thailand, for instance, we collect about the same percent of GDP in VAT, around 4.2, but Thailand can do that with 7%, while we do that with 12%. Once we have a complicated VAT system, this creates a lot of room for negotiations and discretion, and therefore corruption and tax evasion. That is why we need to clean up the VAT system and reduce the number of exemptions, including cooperatives, low-cost housing, and other sectors. And we will return and help them through targeted means via the budget. The good news is we are not touching the senior citizens and people with disability. However, with a national ID in the next 2 years, we will be able to control the massive leakage that this type of complex tax system gives. The next reform, which I will explain a little bit slower, is the increase in the oil excises. We have not adjusted our excise tax on oil products for 20 years. When I started driving, for instance, in 1997, I pay 10 peso per liter for my car for gasoline, of which 4 peso and 35 cents is the excise on gasoline. After 20 years, much richer because I have work, I still pay 4 peso and 35 cents for every liter, which costs around 40 pesos. The truth is, because of non-indexation, as economy improves, as income increases, and as price increases, we lose 145 billion per year, money that could have gone to social protection, healthcare, and education. That is why we are proposing to increase oil excises by 6 pesos, staggered over 3 years. So January 1, 2018, we'll see additional 3 pesos, then additional 2 pesos in 2019, additional 1 peso in 2020, and index to inflation under the DOF proposal. And that is really to address equity, health, and environment. Many people tell me that this tax reform part is anti-poor because the poor will be affected and prices will increase. However, the reality is that 50,000 people surveyed by the Philippine Statistics Authority found that the top 10% of Filipino households, or the richest 2 million, already consume 51% of fuel products and transportation costs. And the top 1%, or the richest 200,000 households, some of us are here, consume 13% of fuel products and transportation costs. The same share consumed by the bottom 50%. The simple reason is that these rich people have cars and many cars, and sometimes only 1 or 2 people ride the cars. When I pay for a full tank in my car, I pay 2,000 a week. The bottom 80% only pays 8 to 20 pesos per day, or not more than 100 peso per week in commuting fare. And for every 8 peso that one pays for a jeep ride, only 2 peso and 40 cents, or 30%, is accounted for by the oil. And the rest will have to pay the driver, the operator, the maintenance, and I also hear the bribes on the road. That is why we need to reform our excise on fuel to arrive at a more progressive, healthier, and cleaner Philippines. Some people say that the prices will escalate and skyrocket. However, we do not find any evidence that there will be a complete and major pass-through of prices. For instance, we estimate that inflation next year will only be 0.9 percentage points higher than the expected 3% of inflation next year. Our inflation will still be within the central bank's 2 to 4% target. Last year, I found that diesel increased by 76%. In January 2016, diesel was 18 pesos per liter. In January 2017, diesel increased to 32 pesos per liter, or a 76% increase. However, we do not see our headline inflation skyrocket. It was very well managed at 2.7%. Food inflation only increased by 3.4%, meaning for every 100 peso we spent on food last year, it is only 103 peso and 40 cents this year. Transportation only 2.4%. In fact, the jeepney fares increased by only 1 peso, not to 14 pesos. And electricity, gas, housing, and water also very minimal. Because unlike in the 70s, where we depend fully on oil to run this economy, we now depend on a lot of energy sources. There's also the income effect, good weather, good agriculture policy, proper importation of rice, and basic supply and demand, and even the weather that affect prices. In fact, even as diesel increased by 76% last year, we do not see laundry bar, sardines, pork, rice, yellow corn, fish, or even noodles increase by that much. That is why we think that this tax reform will not have a major impact on prices. And if it does, then it is because of profiteering. And we in the government are committed to ensure that there will be no abuse of this tax reform. Finally, we are proposing, after 13 years, to increase the excise on automobiles. But we will do this very progressively. The first-time buyers and small families will only pay 10 to 13,000 for a new Vios or a Mirage. Of course, if that family is rich and wants to buy a Land Cruiser, for instance, he will have to pay almost 1 million. But that is the reason behind a progressive tax system. Anyway, for most families, their income increase from the reduction in the personal income tax is far bigger and will fully compensate the increase in the automobile, the oil, the VAT, and the slight increase in inflation. The next question maybe in your mind is, what do we do with the bottom 50% who do not pay income taxes, but will have to pay a little bit more on oil, on the VAT, and if they win a lotto, new Vios? First, we will increase the VAT threshold from the current 1.9 to 3 million pesos of gross sales or gross receipts per year, thereby exempting the sale of goods from VAT for majority of the poor and vulnerable. This will cover the sari-sari store, the small renters, the carinderia. Even if we remove the exemption of cooperatives, cooperatives below the VAT threshold will remain exempted. And all cooperatives in the agriculture sector selling raw agriculture produce will remain exempted, as with all other types of organization. And this will benefit tremendously all the poor and vulnerable who basically purchases from these marginal stores. To mitigate the impact of higher oil excises, we have proposed to Congress the following measures. First, a targeted cash transfer program, around 200 peso per month for 1 year to the poorest 10 million households to mitigate the temporary but moderate increase in prices. This is calculated based on the slight increase in price so that their welfare will not fall. And we intend to coordinate with a number of government agencies, including DSWD, to implement this important reform. The second is the Pantawid Pasada program to provide subsidy to public utility vehicles so that if there is a need for a pass-through of the oil on fares, that will not happen. The third is the Pantawid Kuryente program that will cross-subsidize poor electricity consumers in the SPAG or small power utility group areas, where diesel or bunker fuel are the main sources of energy because they are not connected to the national grid. The fourth is the social welfare card / national ID system, which over time will be the sole basis for determining who gets benefit so that we manage the leakages. And finally, with the help of DOTR, to implement a massive public transport modernization program so that we can see safer, cleaner, and more efficient services on the road. And this is precisely the 40% of incremental revenues that we intend to return to the people immediately. The balance, of course, will be seen over time in better infrastructure, health services, education, social protection, and housing. In summary, I would like to impart 3 key messages which I hope you will bring home to your family and friends. The first is we really need to see the tax reform as a package because that is when 99% of Filipinos will benefit. Not because we only like one tax and do not like the other. We need to see it as a package. Many people I have talked to industry groups, lobbyists, and other special groups say that they fully support the tax reform, except for that particular line that affects their sector. But if I add them all up, we have no tax reform to provide. So I hope people can see through the long term. The second is, more important than the tax reform is how we spend the money. And today we are blessed with the presence of secretaries of DBM, education, and undersecretaries in other departments that will help us deliver these services to the people. The tax reform is like a wedding ceremony. The true test of that binding contract is if it delivers to the people. Finally, this tax reform is about investing in our future. No one here, I suppose, is successful without some hard work, challenges, and a bit of initial pain because of our schooling or our work in our business. And we think that this tax reform, while initially challenging, will provide long-term benefits for majority, if not every Filipino, in the next generation. Personally, I believe that this tax reform is bridging the future. Take, for instance, two students. A rich or well-to-do student who lives in a house, driver brings him to school, has aircon, cold water, electricity. Chances are, if he is hardworking, he will succeed and become a manager or a CEO. However, a poor student will have to cross rivers, mountains, dirty roads, have no running water, sometimes no electricity. That is why learning potential is much less. And this tax reform is really about bridging, paving a path so that the poor 20 million students who are not blessed will have a far better future. Personally, I also experience on the health side a personal experience I would like to share. This is my family. This is my baby Ashby at 3 months. Notice the very fat cheek. When he was 1 year old, he contracted pneumonia and diarrhea. Luckily, I have savings. I brought him to Medical City, and he got the best treatment, the best doctors. But notice the cheek became much thinner. I was told by the Department of Health that every year 26 million babies die from the same diseases, diarrhea and pneumonia. And 60,000 young children below 5 years old die of the same diseases. That is why this tax reform is about making significant, even a doubling of health expenditures so that we can see our babies and children live far longer and productive lives. Ashby's yaya, Marivic, has a son called Ethan. And he is very diligent, doing well in school. He wants to become a seaman, a doctor, or a teacher. And I hope we can provide him and all other young children a way to achieve their dreams so that they can share the benefit as we do today. When I was working in the World Bank, I have met a janitor named Bong who commutes 7 hours a day from his house in Montalban to the World Bank office in Bonifacio Global City. This is like a 66% tax on his productive day at work. Therefore, because he's minimum wage, he has to send his family back to Ormoc Leyte so that he can survive. That is why I think, to end, this administration has a very important role in making a lasting difference in each Filipino's life, in my family, in the people around me, in the people around you, your families, and also to millions of Filipinos who dream of a far better future. That is why we need to do this tax reform, not only for ourselves, but for the future of the country we so love. Thank you very much.